Welcome, everyone, to Bringing the Collective Together, Non-Human Animals, Humans, and Practice at the University. I'm Laura Genera from the Political Science Department at UBC. So today's panel is the last event in our interdisciplinary series here at Green College. Our aim has been to bring together scholars from a range of disciplines to initiate a sophisticated, deliberative, scholarly discussion about the use of animals at the university. As things stand at UBC, there are no mechanisms or forums for critical interdisciplinary deliberation about this issue. However, this series demonstrates that scholars from multiple parts of the academy have important angles of vision to bring to bear on the question of the use of animals. It is our hope that this series triggers then a rethinking of institutional organization and practices, including in the light of democratic values. Canada's existing regulatory system for animals at the university and Canada's institutionally codified conception of humans and animals did not descend from the heavens. These institutional frameworks were not created by all-knowing philosopher kings. Our current institutions and practices have sprung from provisional historical discourses. They've sprung from on-the-ground relations of power and provisional negotiation. Yet despite the historical specificity of our regulatory system, of our linguistic framework, and of our current practices, we come to see them as obviously given, as necessary even, but they are not. To be responsible, we must be aware of the peculiar history that has produced the peculiar institutions and practices in which we are now embedded. We must examine how these peculiar institutions channel research in particular directions and away from other directions. We must examine how our peculiar institutions and practices channel our thinking in particular directions and away from alternative modes of thought. We must examine how our human subjectivity is being cultivated in some ways and away from other potentials that are in us. We must face that in general, historical practices reproduce themselves, but not necessarily because they are the best practices. To dislodge our sense of the necessity and the given nature of current practice, we must examine alternative ways of thinking and practice that history is foreclosing. Today's panelists direct our gaze toward this kind of critical work. As we begin the panel for tonight, then, please also consider that we are on the unceded land of the Musqueam, a nation with a rich conception of right social relations between humans and animals, an example of one ethic that has been undercut by the power relations of colonialism and the Canadian state. And I will now introduce our moderator for the evening, Michael McDonald.
Thank you very much, Laura. This is, as Laura said, the fifth and final session. I'm Michael McDonald, and I was a speaker in the last session for those of you who are faithful attendees. And I'm a professor emeritus of applied ethics in the W. Morris Young Center for Applied Ethics at this university. In the four previous sessions, we covered topics of the ethics of the use of animals in research, scientific use of animals in research, governance of non-human animals used in research, a presentation by the eminent primatologist Frans de Waal on what non-human animals can teach us about empathy. And videos of each of these things are available on the web, so we're not going to try and reprise all that at this point, okay? My role this evening is to moderate this session, and we are going to, I'll give you the, if you like, the order of the day. The order of the day is that we are going to have 4 presentations, limited to 12 minutes, and I will be strict about the 12 minutes so that we have discussion time. And then we will have, I think, a fair amount of time, 50 minutes for audience discussion. And then we're going to give each of the panelists 2 minutes for any sort of concluding thoughts. And then Professor Gennara, who arranged this series, is going to offer some concluding wisdom or whatever benediction at the end of this entire process. And we will bring the discussion to a conclusion before, I think, around 7, we're trying for around 7 o'clock, I think. It's my pleasure. I'm going to introduce the speakers in one at a time so that then they can do their presentation, then I'll get up and do the next one. So I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Manisha Dekka. She is an associate professor of law at the University of Victoria. Her research interests include critical animal studies, post-colonial feminist theory, health law, and bioethics. Her work has appeared in the Canadian Journal of Women in the Law, Ethics in the Environment, the Harvard Journal of Gender and Law, the Journal of Critical Animal Studies, the Medical Law Review, and Sexualities, among other publications. She has received grants from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And in 2008, she held the Fulbright Visiting Chair at Law and Society at New York University. Misha?
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking all the students and faculty, especially Laura, who have organized this entire series. It's wonderful to be a part of it. And I'd also like to appreciate and acknowledge all of us being on Musqueam land today. In fact, I'd like to go back to the opening remarks given by Mr. Sparrow in the very first panel of this series last fall about how these conversations can move us toward a different type of relationship and respect for animals. And my focus today is going to be about the law and how the law, in my opinion, actually impedes this type of a relationship currently, but also to suggest, drawing from a very recent dissenting appellate level judgment, how the law could also move forward through a perspective that aligns with feminist relational theory. Okay, so I take up this discussion in relation to one of the questions posed by this series, and the question is, how might animal voices best be heard and attended to by a democratic public? And coming from a legal perspective, one of the principles that are said to be so important to democracy is this idea of the rule of law. And the rule of law, quite simply, in its basic formulation, is the principle that everyone must be bound by the law. Right? So we live in a society, if there's a legal system, then we're all supposed to be bound by it. In Canada, this is both a written constitutional norm, so it's there in our Constitution. It's also an unwritten constitutional norm. And it's been recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada as being part of those unwritten norms that nonetheless are very powerful and foundational to our perspective and our legal system. It was a principle that was very recently articulated in a case that I'll be talking about later on from the Alberta Court of Appeal. So this is the Chief Justice, Catherine Fraser, speaking, and she's in dissent here, but she gives us a snapshot of what the rule of law means. So let's just take some time to read that out. The rule of law, which forms part of the bedrock of our democracy, requires that all government action comply with the law. No one in Canada is above the law, and that includes government itself. So one of the things that the rule of law does is not just to demand that all of us here as individual residents or citizens respect the law, but that government itself, so that the lawmakers themselves respect the law. And the way we enforce that respect is by having an independent judiciary. So you have a judicial branch of government that is kind of the checkpoint for government action, either at the legislative level, in terms of constitutional parameters of that legislation must meet, or at the executive branch level, in terms of the wide range of executive action that goes on in our society through the administrative state. Okay, so the rule of law, I would suggest, is a problem for animals. Why? Well, very simply, the law is an anthropocentric tool, right? And to the extent it doesn't focus on human beings, it focuses on corporations. It does not focus on other non-human entities like animals. So animals in our common law system are not legal subjects that the law can see. They're not persons, right? This term we give to this idea of a legal subject. Rather, they're classified as property, or they're amenable to propertization if they're wild animals. So there's no tradition in the common law for applying this idea of the rule of law and holding government to account vis-a-vis animals. So let's just consider the context that is bringing us all together, the use of animals in research facilities. So in Canada, as other panels have kind of explained, we have this body of the CCAC, but it's a an agency that is separated from government, right? It's a not-for-profit organization, and it's not animated by a legislative scheme. So there's not primary legislation, there's not subordinate legislation. It has its own guidelines and policies. There is no law that regulates its behavior, that it's specific to it as an industry, let's say, or as a overseeing body. So what that does is that because of the dearth of the legal material in this area to kind of organize behavior, it's very difficult to go through the formal channels of judicial review. So in most regulated industries where there is a legislative scheme, what happens is that the administrative state is set up through the executive to regulate in an area. And when they take a decision, that decision is normally subject to judicial review, such that decisions can be reviewed by judges as to how the government has behaved in a certain file or matter, what decision it has taken, right? So this type of system is unavailable when there's no law to begin with, because there's nothing to review. Okay, so what is required for real change, right? And so I would suggest we need a legal paradigm shift. There's a wide variety of opinions on how exactly the law should change. I just have time right now to speak of the one that I'm most sympathetic with, and that's the idea of actually, ending the property status of animals and giving animals personhood, or some sort of similar legal tool that represents the same type of interest, whether it's called personhood or not. And the most prominent proponent of this position is an American animal rights legal scholar, Gary Francione, at Rutgers University. And what are typically given as the reasons for this position, right? Why is this position a legitimate position? And it's the idea that animals are sentient, and to this extent that they're sentient, they should receive moral consideration, just as because they can suffer and feel pain and distress. And another argument that is given to sustain this position about why animals should be persons and not property is the fact that the human-animal boundary that we now operate with in every realm of society is illegitimate in the sense that it is arbitrary. It's the idea that you cannot point to a single biological difference that categorically separates humans from animals, something that all humans share and no animals don't, for example. Okay, so what would this type of position mean then for animals used in research? Well, it would mean an end of research, not just regulation. Why? Because animals are seen in this type of liberal paradigm to be non-consenting moral subjects. Okay, so while the personhood argument can be very powerful and persuasive for those looking for, a discourse to reach an endpoint of the end of animal exploitation completely, not just regulation. For myself, I find somewhat of a troubling logic inherent to it in terms of how the argument proceeds, and that's its reliance on a sameness logic. So this idea of sameness rather than difference. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's just briefly go back to those two ingredients, sentience and the absence of a categorical biological difference. If you examine these reasons in this position, what they're basically saying is that animals should matter to the extent animals are similar to that category of subjects we already recognize morally and legally, human beings, right? So the benchmark is set, and then everyone who can show sameness to that benchmark should come under the purview of morality and the law. So it's a logic that kind of aims at inclusion and equality through a logic of sameness rather than a respect for difference. So I would advocate a more critical attention to difference. So what I'd like to consider is this last question here. Is there a way to articulate the wrong of animal exploitation without resorting to a sameness type of argument? And I would suggest we can find that type of argument in relational feminist theory to supplement rather than completely trump other types of arguments, but to bring a different perspective into the mix of how we might perceive and think about animals. So just very briefly, what are the main tenets of relational feminist theory? It's kind of an opposition to classic liberal arguments about how we imagine ourselves in relation to others, right? So liberalism is very fixated on that individual, autonomous, independent actor. Whereas relational theory, especially feminist relational theory, starts with the premise that we come into this world and we leave this world in relations with others, right? We never meet that kind of elusive liberal rational actor. It focuses not just on personal relationships with your spouse or children or siblings or parents, but relationships also incorporate the idea of systemic relationships, power and injustice. So this type of theory asks, how can we develop and sustain just relationships? And instead of proceeding on sameness logic, it attends to difference, the idea of embodiment and vulnerability. Okay, so the last part here is, how can relational feminist theory change how the law perceives animals? Okay, and so this is a picture. Does anyone know this picture at all? This is of Lucy in the Edmonton Zoo, and she is the subject, indirectly, of the Alberta Court of Appeal case that I mentioned at the outset. And what I want to suggest is that relational feminist theory, just far from being abstract, actually can have a practical impact, and it did in this litigation. Okay, so I really quickly have to explain this litigation to get to the point about how Chief Justice Fraser talked about Lucy. So what's going on here? Basically, Lucy is in the Edmonton Zoo, and she's suffering chronic health problems relating to the space, but really the fact that she's has been isolated for the last 4 years. She had a partner for 20 years. That partner was taken away, and she's alone, and she's one of only elephants in North America who's living alone, and there's a sanctuary in the United States that will take her, and people who want to move her there. Okay, Alberta does have an Animal Protection Act. Okay, and you can see that there's it's an offense to cause an animal to be in distress. So how is that act operationalized? The Humane Society is a designated agent of the government to enforce this statute. Okay, it's been given that power. So the appellants here complain to the Humane Society. They reply with a position that's in the best interest of Lucy not to be moved. And that's the zoo's position as well. So the appellants then come to court to seek a declaratory remedy. They just want a declaration that there's a violation of the law here. Okay, so the legal issue then becomes, can the appellant seek a declaration against the City of Edmonton, who owns Edmonton Valley Zoo and runs it, for their non-compliance with the Animal Protection Act? Okay, the majority, so at the Court of Appeal you have a 3-judge panel, so 2 of the judges constituting the majority said no, that this was an abusive process, which is a legal test that was met. Why? Because the Alberta Protection Act, the Animal Protection Act, is seen to be like a quasi-criminal statute. And it depends on the designated agent, here the Humane Society, to kind of lay a charge, right? It's not a criminal statute, that's a criminal code, but quasi-criminal in that sense. No one else can do it. All right, so if they decide not to do it, potentially the Attorney General could make a different decision, but that hasn't happened. What the appellants are asking to do, because they feel that the existing law is not being enforced by the government agent against the government, the City of Edmonton, they're trying to go the civil route and get a new remedy. And that's what the court sees as abusive process. The dissent, in a very lengthy dissent, says the appellant should have their day in court and would qualify for public interest standing. So there are many reasons why this dissent is remarkable, and I just want to look at the last one. It treats animals seriously and connects to the rule of law. This is a judgment that goes far beyond anything anyone has ever said in the judicial context about animals in Canada, or anywhere for that matter. This is a dissent, so it's not the law. But look at what the Chief Justice says, and this is the last slide here. This is her opening paragraph. An elephant is a social animal. And if you look to the red, she says, some may consider this appeal and the claims on behalf of Lucy inconsequential, perhaps even frivolous. They would be wrong. And then look to the green. It also is about the right of people in a democracy to ensure that the government itself is not above the law. So what has gone on in this case is a connection of animal issues to the rule of law through the emphasis on the relationality of the animal and the vulnerability of the animal. And this is in an area where there is a law that's not being enforced. In medical research, we don't even have that, right? But this is one way that the law could move forward to a different type of endpoint for animals.
Thank you very much. We next have Professor Max Cameron. Professor Cameron teaches at UBC in the Department of Political Science. He is director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, under the aegis of which he's, well, I guess this is an old announcement. He was going to have a conference on why don't more good people enter politics, which for many of us seems like, yeah, I can see why. And he's also this year has been the Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. And in that context, he led a colloquium series, Between Rules and Practice, Why We Need Practical Wisdom in Politics. And Dr. Cameron is the author of numerous books and articles on Latin America, and I'm not going to read you all the titles, and other topics, including NAFTA and the global ban on landmines, I saw, as well as other things. And hope there are no landmines here for you.
What I'm going to say this evening, I think in many ways really reinforces and builds on some of the things that Manisha has already said to you. But I want to begin with the question, are non-human animals entitled to moral consideration? And I want to argue that to say that animals, including humans, are entitled to moral consideration is a claim that, in the first instance, says that we're capable of moral sentiments with respect to other animals. Moral sentiments refer to the experience of what's good or bad, happiness or suffering, right or wrong. And we generally say that what's good is what causes us pleasure, makes us happy. What's bad is what causes us pain and sorrow. We praise others as good who make others happy. We condemn those who make others suffer. And we believe it's wrong to take pleasure in the pain or misfortune of others, or to feel bad because others are well. Moral sentiments become moral rules, that is, explicit rights and obligations, when we generalize about the effects of our actions on others. But moral rules rest on the foundation of moral sentiments. These sentiments are not the result of revelation or scripture. They're not external to our senses or perceptions. They're produced by the faculties that we have evolved as mammals and are part of how our bodies and brains are wired. These faculties include empathy, intentionality, reciprocity, communication, problem solving, conflict resolution, and judgment. We are endowed with these faculties at birth, but they must be cultivated, as Aristotle understood, if we are to achieve our full potential as moral agents. Sophisticated culture and institutions have enabled the development of our moral capacities and our depravities. And this makes us distinctive, but not unique. Decades of research make it abundantly clear that all or most of the faculties that are required for moral sentiments exist to some degree or other in mammals and birds. And it's therefore appropriate to speak of morality among animals. But do they have rights? After all, humans alone have transformed moral sentiments into complex systems of formal, enforceable rights and obligations. And there's a long tradition of Western thought that insists that these complex systems lift us out of the state of nature. I think there are three responses to this. First, we shouldn't overstate the importance of rules. Morality has less to do with the logic behind formal rules than with the practices that we learn through imitation, observation, and habituation. We can generalize these practices and thereby formulate the general rules. But moral sentiments are based on empathy and care for others, starting with kith and kin. And this capacity emerged through the evolutionary process. In this sense, our moral behavior doesn't separate us quite so unequivocally as we might think from our closest mammalian relatives. Second, not all humans have the same faculties for moral judgment, but this doesn't prevent us from extending them rights and obligations. For example, children are generally regarded as entitled to the same consideration as adults, even though we wouldn't allow them to vote or drive a car. The same can be said of the mentally handicapped or victims of degenerative diseases. It's not impossible to extend rights to those who cannot claim them for themselves, but also to limit those rights in accordance with their capacities for agency. There are no clear lines between the child and the adult, the healthy and the disabled, the human and the non-human animal, only degrees of difference and similarity. Third, rights are not absolute. Rights always have to be balanced. My rights have to be balanced against your rights. The rights of individuals have to be balanced against the rights of groups. The rights of one generation have to be balanced against the rights of another. And I believe that a similar balance is necessary between humans and non-human animals. I can see, for example, no objection to a human hunter who kills an animal to survive a long, hard, cold winter, and who approaches the task with genuine gratitude to nature for subsistence. The balance of rights there, I think, favors the hunter, especially if the hunting activity forms part of an ecologically and socially sustainable practice. The same cannot be said for the consumer who purchases cheap factory-farmed meat in the supermarket. Factory farming is not only cruel to specific animals and commodifies animals in ways that violate their inherent sociability, it's also environmentally unsustainable. So to recap, many animals are capable of key features of morality. Rights can be extended to those who cannot defend them for themselves, and rights are not absolute but have to be balanced. And a number of implications follow from this for the ethical treatment of animals in research. First, it is arbitrary and contrary to a substantial body of good science, much of which, in fact, generated by people in this room, that shows that it would be wrong to assume that only humans are capable of moral sentiments and hence deserve moral consideration. And the history of human oppression cautions against the presumption that we can know the capacity for moral sentiment and reasoning in others that we do not understand, even humans. Failure to appreciate the moral capacities of others contributed to the subjugation of slaves, women, and indigenous people. So prudence dictates that we err on the side of a generous view of the moral capacities of persons we do not understand well. Second, rights are not absolute. The rights of animals flow, as we see in the court case, from an agreement among humans to protect animal welfare. And our concern for animals should correspond to the kind of social relationships that they establish among themselves and that we establish with them, and these vary. So, for example, animals in general are capable of pleasure and pain, happiness and suffering. Mammals and birds specifically are social creatures that derive pleasure and pain from interaction with other animals, including humans. And sophisticated mammals, including marine mammals like dolphins and whales, primates and elephants, experience frustration and depression, as is the case of Lucy in Edmonton, when treated unjustly or isolated. Animals capable of developing cultures and institutions, who engage in pro-social and cooperative behavior, who care for their offspring and form lasting unions with mates, deserve, in my view, greater moral consideration than animals that live solitary, antisocial, amoral, or predatory lives. So let me conclude with a few further reflections. It's not good enough to simply say that we should stop animal research, as if all research using animals was repugnant and indefensible. But nor is it acceptable to dismiss all objections to animal research with blanket denials of wrongdoing. We need to see the shades of gray. For example, a researcher who destroys primates in a laboratory had better be able to defend such actions in public in terms of a very high standard of proof of the benefits to humans. The bar, I think, should be lower with respect to animals who don't have the same inner moral existence of a primate. But the bar is not set by some absolute standard or external criterion. It's part of the social activity involved in the construction of the rule of law. And consequently, ethical review boards cannot approach their task from a simple utilitarianism. We should understand that there is a quasi-judicial function to ethics review boards. They are not just doing cost-benefit analysis. They are making the common law, and consequently, they should be absolutely transparent to the public. And I'm glad that Manisha raised the example of Lucy, who I was going to mention. Some of you may have seen in the Globe and Mail an editorial yesterday on the plight of Lucy, the slave elephant owned by the city of Edmonton. Alberta has, as Manisha has pointed out, animal welfare laws, but who protects the slave when the government, which was responsible for protecting animal welfare, owns it? Who speaks for the animals in a court of law? Who speaks for animals in our ethics review boards? I think this is exactly the question that we should be asking. The rule of law, and I think it's also a problem with separation of powers, which would be interesting, I think, to discuss perhaps in the Q&A. But surely the perspectives of animals themselves, to the extent that they live social lives and have an inner moral existence, must be included in our deliberations. Ethics review boards should be concerned first with the protection of animals, second, with the needs of the public, and lastly, the interests of researchers. So let me finish with a final thought that I hope will be a segue into the next presentation that Ken Sharp will make, which is that in a democratic society, rights are balanced through deliberative procedures. These procedures generally fail, however, to include the perspectives of nature and future generations. And we therefore need deliberative mechanisms that offer a wider compass of concern, a greater capacity for empathy, including across species, and a more generous and encompassing idea of the collective and its interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. Our next speaker is Professor Kenneth Sharp. He's the W.R. Keenan Professor of Political Science at Swarthmore College, where he teaches political philosophy, practical ethics, Latin American politics, and foreign policy. He's currently teaching a course at UBC with Max Cameron called Practical Wisdom. His most recent work, co-authored with Professor Barry Schwartz at Swarthmore, is Practical Wisdom, The Right Way to Do the Right Thing. His previous book, Drug War Politics, The Price of Denial, was a finalist for the C. Wright Mills Award from the Society for the Study of Social Problems. Among his other important works are The State and the Transnational Corporations, The Political Economy of the Mexican Auto Industry, and The Real Cause of Iran-Gate. Sharp has published articles in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, the LA Times, the Boston Globe, the Nation, and the American Prospect. Dr. Sharp.
Thank you, Laura, for organizing these panels. And I also wanted to thank Darren Chang, who's sitting over here, for his help in thinking about some of the governance issues as I was preparing this talk. Today I want to talk about something called practical wisdom and why it's so important to consider for those who are concerned about the governance of animal treatment here at UBC. And then I want to talk about the importance of encouraging the decision makers who are involved in that governance to learn practical wisdom. When the members of the Animal Care Committee here at UBC, I may sometimes call that by its acronym the ACC, make decisions about animal research, they depend on rules and guidelines that are grounded in moral considerations. But they're not as deep and nuanced, these guidelines, as the ones Max has suggested. The existing guidelines are written by the Canadian Council on Animal Care, that we often refer to here as the CCAC. They include things like, for example, you can only use animals in research if it can reasonably be expected to benefit humans or animals. So that, I think, would rule out, for example, cosmetics research, and it seems to have from what earlier speakers have said. Or, for example, look for non-animal alternatives. Or, for example, employ the most humane methods on the smallest number of appropriate animals required to obtain valid information. If pain and distress are necessary, it must be minimized in intensity and duration. Now, Max has argued that these guidelines should be deepened. He just put it to us, animals capable of complex cultures and institutions who engage in pro-social and cooperative group behavior, who care for offspring and form lasting unions with mates, deserve greater moral consideration than those animals that live solitary, antisocial, amoral, and predatory lives. Since committee decisions are shaped by these moral guidelines, Max has framed an important discussion for us. Are these the right moral considerations for what ought to be done? I want to raise a closely related issue. Suppose we change the guidelines governing ACC decisions and granted the kind of moral considerations that Max and others here have advocated. We're still left with difficult moral choices that no guideline and no rule can answer for us. Figuring out what to actually do in a particular case is different from figuring out what ought to be done in general. It demands that people who sit on these committees have what Aristotle and others have called practical wisdom. They need the moral skill, and they need the moral will to choose well in situations where choice is often not clear. There are at least 3 reasons for this. First, approving or disapproving research is rarely a debate between good and evil, between greedy cosmetic companies versus helpless animals. Those, I think, are the easy decisions. It's more ordinarily about balancing moral goods that are always in conflict and will never be settled. No suffering of animals, the right to a flourishing life for each member of a species, minimizing the suffering of higher order primates, these are good principles. But so are principles about preserving ecosystems. So are principles about preserving the health of an animal species or of human beings. If a researcher can show that finding vaccines to protect an animal or human population from swine flu or avian influenza or Ebola or Lyme disease or yellow fever, these were examples that Bill Nelson gave us in an earlier session, they can show that these things depend on research which cause pain or lead to the killing of some animals, then a rule about right to life or restrictions on suffering doesn't help. Either way, there will be someone or something that will suffer or lose a life. Nelson argued that developing Salk polio vaccine, for example, demanded basic research which involved animals up to monkeys. And this vaccine, he pointed out, not only prevented pain and suffering and death of human animals, but was used by people like Jane Goodall to save a colony of monkeys. So my claim is, no matter what principle or rules that smart and well-motivated ethicists or activists come up with, utilitarian, Kantian, feminist, practical decisions will still always demand some balancing. And those who do the balancing need the moral commitment, the moral will, to reach a fair decision, and they need the moral skill to deliberate and choose. Second, the key terms of any set of guidelines always need to be interpreted. We see this in strict laws against sexual harassment. You need judges and juries to interpret whether a particular case was a case of harassment and how serious that harassment was. The Animal Care Committee at UBC is given authority to, quote, stop any objectionable procedure if it considers that unnecessary distress or pain is being experienced by an animal. So, like the people who were judges or on juries, the members of an ACC need to interpret exactly what unnecessary distress or pain is. If animals can be used only in research that can reasonably be expected to benefit human animals, then members need to interpret what benefit means. So whatever moral considerations we come up with, whatever guidelines we have, what constitutes these moral considerations for different animals in different cases is always going to demand interpretation. Third, one needs the know-how to figure out when a less harmful to animals alternative is possible. Nellie Auersberg told us in one of the earlier panels that she was studying how normal cells became cancerous. Her moral motivation was to resist experimentation on any animals. She created tissue cells from humans to do the experiments. But there came a time, she said, when she had to use animals because the limits of research on tissue cultures became apparent to her. It turned out that those things that cause cancer in cultured human cell tissue did not work when she put them in mice, i.e., they did not work in real cells. So they reached a point where Nellie, who herself did not want to use animals, had to use animals. So the people who judge research protocols like Nellie's, who are guided by a harm minimization principle, need the moral as well as technical skills to draw the lines in ambiguous and difficult situations. Now I want to turn to my second question very briefly. There's no reason to believe that anyone who first becomes a member of an animal care committee at UBC or any place else has the practical wisdom to deliberate well about these tough ethical issues. So how do people learn the practical wisdom they need to deal with the quandaries that are built in to the very practice of animal care and welfare? There's a wonderfully simple answer to this question. You learn how to deliberate well by deliberating. In fact, the only way you can learn how to balance tough moral and ethical questions is by trying to balance them. You learn through trial and error. You put people on these committees, you give them a required orientation session to learn the CCAC guidelines and learn about UBC animal care use procedures, and then you hope the committee members learn by doing. But you can only learn wisdom through experience if you have the right experience. If those that mentor and model for the new members don't know how to deliberate well, new members may not learn. Mentoring might result in subtle intimidation, which is actually a problem that people who've done research on these committees have uncovered. There's also the risk that non-scientists won't have the know-how or the courage to participate in these discussions, and that the scientists won't have the moral skill to fix the process. But there's evidence also that you can improve the deliberation learning curve, to coin an awkward phrase, by creating programs and structures which might help all committee members learn how to deliberate better. For example, when the BC Citizens Assembly was created here in British Columbia, 130 representatives from British Columbia were chosen by lot from all over the province, and they were given the task of deliberating about what the best electoral system would be for the province. Those who set up the process, including people like Ken Carty here at UBC, spent a lot of time designing programs to help educate those representatives. Before they even started deliberating, they learned about the pros and cons of proportional representation and winner-take-all schemes. There were lectures by staff experts and invited visitors. But they also learned how to deliberate well. They attended a workshop on the challenges of deliberation. They practiced, as it were, listening, open-mindedness, respect, clear communication, and other dispositions necessary for deliberation. Researchers who studied the process after it was finished, including Ken Carty, examined the arguments of critics who thought that the lack of political sophistication by some citizens would result in a deliberative process dominated by the better educated and more knowledgeable. But they concluded, and I quote, that there were no systematic differences between the more and less sophisticated members with respect to their processes of judgment and final preferences, implying that institutional design, particularly the learning phase of the citizen assemblies, compensated for these initial inequalities. So, if people at UBC wanted to improve the institutional design of the ACC process to encourage wiser deliberation, what might they do? I don't have simple answers for that, but just to get our imaginations going. Imagine, for example, a training program in which facilitators used problem-based learning methods, like the ones used at law schools or business schools. They wrote up actual cases, they had the members practice deliberating about those cases, and then they analyzed how they would have better handled that case. Or imagine new members or a whole committee sitting in on or watching a video of another good committee working through a difficult issue or two and then trying to do it themselves. Or imagine if they were required to come to a series of panels like the ones Laura has been organizing. Is such redesign allowed? Yes, the CCAC guidelines explicitly encourage institutions like UBC to, quote, sponsor seminars or workshops on the use of animals in science and ethics of animal experimentation, and encourage as many animal users, animal caregivers, students, ACC members, and other interested parties to attend as possible. So to conclude, what I'm suggesting is not the only way to encourage wiser deliberation on animal care committees. And even if we could help those who govern do better in resolving the daily and difficult ethical choices they face, this would not quickly or dramatically change animal care at UBC. But it would continue to push forward the slow process of changing the public deliberation on animal research. If we ask the question, how can the committee members and the public be educated to deliberate wisely, I think we'll find some answers, and the 5 panels that Laura has organized, I think, are a good first step. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken, for the very thoughtful presentation. Now my privilege to introduce my colleague, Michael Burgess. Michael is a professor and research chair in biomedical ethics at the W. Morris Young Center for Applied Ethics in the Department of Medical Genetics at the University of BC. And his research has emphasized social research on perspectives that are marginalized by mainstream approaches to ethics and policy. His focus over the past decade has been in health, science, and technology policy and public engagement based on theories of deliberative democracy. His work has been funded by Genome BC in the province of British Columbia, and Genome Canada and Genome BC. The research team has developed an approach to deliberative engagement with 8 events in BC at the Mayo Clinic and in Western Australia. The most common topic has been biobanks, but his work has been cited in numerous places, and they produced over 40 papers in this and have had a lot of fun actually doing their things. And Michael has recently completed some time as principal of the College for Interdisciplinary Studies and is now, I think, the missionary for the university looking at issues and some of the very difficult issues in the area of personalized medicine. So, Mike?
We didn't coordinate the culture of slides or not, so I will use them just because they might be slightly more entertaining. That's all on that side. Sorry, this is. We have. There we go. Good. So I'm going to locate this in the context of looking at deliberative engagement in a very different context, and then ask what kind of lessons we can learn for animal welfare. I'm going to try to put it, sorry, on the slide.
Just have to press here.
This is the Mac to PC. It's not the file, it's the brain. Wrong one. Should be right there. Apologies. There we go. So I want to quickly go through 4 points, but really focus on the last one. Are the moral positions irreconcilable? Are the situations we're talking about really where we're sitting in the face of moral controversy? Is the policy issue urgent? And I'll explain why that's important. How do we make decisions without ignoring the diversity of moral opinion? And how can deliberative public engagement contribute to trustworthy governance? So we'll come back to the issues of governance and practical wisdom and the different elements of governance systems. I think they're important. I try to position myself between resolution of challenging moral problems and the critical literature. And so I think Michael McDonald, who's actually the founder of the Center for Applied Ethics, has always emphasized for us that the key here is engaging deeply with the different moral controversies, coming in with technical knowledge, good social analysis, and then asking questions about how we move ahead in collaboration with all those who have interests. So the first question is, are the positions morally irreconcilable? I think we've begun to sketch this out. I won't spend a lot of time on that. But on one hand, we have that the research use of animals is necessary. And we sort of had enough of a review of that I don't want to spend too much time on that. And then there's a variety of reasons why we say the research use of animals is unethical. And it could be because of, for deontological reasons in terms of rights, it could be because we just can't actually justify the harms based on the goods we derive, or that there's just no distinction that we can hold that's credible between humans and animals, and so we have to extend full personhood, full moral status and legal status to animals. But is the policy issue urgent? One of the reasons I ask that question is because if we have moral dispute, and there's nothing urgent about resolving that moral dispute, we live in that kind of moral dispute. The challenge here is that we actually probably have situations that are unacceptable. From an animal research perspective, there's the issue of red tape. So the challenge here is how do we actually make decisions about animal welfare while we actually achieve some of the goods that we're trying to achieve. And then, of course, from an animal welfare perspective, ethics committees might sort of look like this. So that we really are, not to make, I mean, cartoons are fun, but not to make fun of this, we really are in a situation where we really are trying to make some decisions, and there's genuine moral controversy. I'm coming from the perspective of looking at biobanks. Very quickly, the challenge with biobanks, these are tissue repositories, typically human, but they can be environmental. The challenge here is that these are collected in order to be the basis for research that we can't anticipate. And they enable a kind of research that lets us do population-based studies, and it also lets us do things like genomic studies to detect very small differences between people that will allow us to have improved human health, human care, and population health. The challenge with them is that normally when we ask individual humans to donate tissues, we ask for informed consent and we protect their privacy as an individual human right. But we cannot anticipate the research questions that will be asked or that will be used for biobanks, so we actually cannot get valid informed consent and the kind of privacy protection we want in biobanks. So there's a real challenge and a trade-off between that sort of liberal notion of individual protection and the pursuit of the collective good. And that is similar, in that sense, it's a structure problem that's very similar to the one we have in the case of animal welfare. And looking at biobanks and in areas of research ethics, we've seen some conceptual shifts that I think are conceptual shifts in bioethics or applied ethics in general, and includes engaging the different ways in which we reconceptualize what the moral tools are. One is an increased expectation that researchers, research institutions are accountable for the benefits they promise. They can't merely say that trust us, research is a good thing for us to do. Science will produce benefits. The second is there's greater participant and community involvement in actual research design. From developing countries, through indigenous communities, through patient advocacy groups, we're seeing groups that not only do they say you have to approach us as a group before you approach our individuals, but they're saying we want to tell you where to do the research, how to do the research, and in fact, we'll ourselves develop the research funding mechanisms to lead the research. And then there are actually some people in patient advocacy groups who themselves are doing the genome sequencing in garages. So they're actually, the community and the research communities are blending. And then there's an emphasis on adaptive or dynamic governance, because as I said, many of the kinds of things we expected human rights and that kind of individual focus to protect are now ineffective. And if they are effective, they prevent us from pursuing collective interests. So the emphasis here is in governance is on the policy or the law. It's also on the structures about how those policies are implemented and how those decisions are made, and on the practices. And we've sort of heard references to the law, the structure, and the practices. And that taken together is what we mean by governance. And it needs to be responsive, as we've heard, to emerging issues, but also emerging knowledges. There are many discourses we hear here that are helping us understand what our relationships are to animals and how do we develop practical wisdom in terms of continuing to exercise those judgments. And they have to be exercised before laws change, and they also have to reflect back on how should laws change. So that's the sort of focus on it. And so the question is now how to make good policy choices when reasonable people disagree, experts, stakeholders, and institutions do not adequately represent the full diversity in society. We're not a representative sample in this room. And surveys do not provide informed or robust advice on complex matters. If I want to know how you're going to vote tomorrow, a survey is a pretty good predictor. But if I want to know how you're going to feel about a particular animal experiment, to get robust opinions is very difficult because different media exposures, different kinds of information, different charismatic personalities will shift that over time. So your individual opinion is difficult to predict, difficult to use in terms of directing policy or practice. So I'm using this word deliberative democracy, although there are a lot of very theoretical definitions. I find Patrick Hamlet's a more practical definition. And the thing about deliberative democracy is it's not simply to ensure that excluded groups are included in the conversation, but it's to express a reasoned, informed, consensual judgment forged out of initially disparate knowledge, values, and preferences of the participants, as these evolve in a deliberative experience itself. So in some ways, we were hearing earlier about the ways in which animal care committees can evolve practical wisdom and can become more deliberative. The point here is that deliberation is not always an attempt to change individuals' minds as much as come together in deciding how we live together in difference, and that becomes a theme here. In political science, and here I am ironically a moral philosopher talking about political science with another political scientist in the room, but the mini-public is a kind of approach in deliberative democracy that suggests, like the BC Citizens Assembly, like the Ontario Citizens Assembly, like the Canadian citizen juries on xenotransplantation, that you can take a subset of the public, and you can help them understand the issues, the technical issues, the various social perspectives, and they can give informed opinion that can contribute to policy, but also can contribute to the trustworthiness of those governance mechanisms. We've tried this, as Michael mentioned, on 8 occasions in collaborations here in BC, in the Mayo Clinic, and in Western Australia. And I won't go through a lot of this, just to say that we've tried it. We use, just like they did with the Citizens Assembly, the transcripts to look and track at the deliberation, to see the ways in which it's informed, to see how charismatic individuals affect this, to see whether speakers and alternative perspectives are taken up and critically assessed. And frankly, the first time that we did this, I was quite surprised at the extent to which publics who we were selecting, because they weren't interested in the issues of biobanks, were able to grapple with the issues and come up with informed advice. So what's the role of why do we go to a deliberative engagement of this kind? Well, one of them is to counter capture by strongly vested interests. And that means those of us who identify deeply with a particular position, a particular moral position. Because the very thing we're trying to figure out is, how do we live together in moral diversity? And so we can't let the conversation merely be among those who have strong positions. We need explicit representation of the diversity that exists, not just in the positions, in the moral positions, though those too need to be represented, but in society. Different life experiences lead people to make different moral judgments, in some ways to have different moral intuitions and sentiments that we need to understand. And that could be a First Nations or a perspective of care, it could be a theoretical perspective, but often a lived perspective. So in these deliberations, we really emphasize that people learn to listen to each other. That what we're after here is not necessarily change positions, but for people to give reasons why a certain conclusion would be a group decision that's the best we can do with and how we live together in that moral diversity that supports policy decisions, and in an ideal world, it promotes public trust in the conclusions. But this is not a naturally occurring thing. It's not easy to get people to respectfully listen. It's not easy to get them to shift off, particularly in moral positions, from deciding where I stand and how do I get my way, or how do I insist that others do what I think is morally correct, particularly on moral perspectives, and to shift over instead to how do we live together and quit trying to change each other's minds as much as find ways of compromise, so that when we don't agree what the decision should be, can we at least agree on a way to get to a decision where we say that's a fair way, but we also see a way of challenging that, a way of coming back. The first thing we do when we draw conclusions in deliberative groups is we identify persistent disagreements. Where do you really disagree? Where is the action going to stay, where we have to keep back and reviewing that? And based on identifying those persistent disagreements, then when we get convergence, we get people converging on what they agree to live together with without giving up on those things that they want to maintain as persistent disagreements. So the emphasis here is that we have a very explicit structuring of the way that we do this, but at the same time, it's given back to the participants to be able to redefine the agendas as we work through. Quickly, does this make a difference? I mean, I think this is sort of the million-dollar question that I get, particularly in healthcare and policy questions. What difference does this make? You get a good feeling discussion. What happens? Well, in Western Australia, they took the OECD guidelines on biobanks and they took it to a stakeholder deliberation and to a public deliberation, and they went back and forth based on those conclusions, and now those are the guidelines for the state of Western Australia. The guidelines were negotiated through the deliberation. Governance, so not policy, not the words, but the ways in which we structure them. The Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, both for a 50-year-old epidemiology project and for their biobanks, found out that the 25 people who sat in a room for 2 weekends and debated this were better public representatives than anyone they could recruit. So they set them up as an advisory and invited other community members, and they didn't find other community members could catch up with the depth of knowledge and the ability to listen and to come and to focus on group decisions. So the deliberative process itself skills people up, and that's where it becomes important to have a kind of public advisory so that there's a great deal of transparency on that. And in the BC Bio Library, which is a complicated arrangements of the use of your clinical specimens that are left over so we can do research, that one found that by discussing with the deliberants, who said what we really want is physicians telling us about the biobank for the first time, which is impossible. It's just financially impossible to arrange that in the institutional structure. They did find ways of improving the ways in which they initially introduced people to the biobanks, and they're receiving now a far higher accrual rate. Not because they're manipulating people, we believe, but because they're now hitting how people in BC would like to first hear about this, and they end up with a more sympathetic or a more open audience. So policy, governance, and practice. The transformative effects, just to conclude on this, at the community level, participants, and they saw this in the Citizens' Assembly as well, end up back in communities promoting not their perspective, but deliberation and the importance of the issue. They generate discussions. The administratively responsible people, the people that I just talked about from the different venues, who are involved in helping shaping the questions and are there to observe the sessions, end up with an incredible increase of motivation because they see the trust put in them and the importance of the issues, and they begin to engage. And I actually think we see a heightened sense of responsibility. And then we see community participation. So one of the things we most want to do is be able to generate this kind of conversation in a more inclusive way. So what would be the next steps for me? I would say that what we need is to make sure that, and I think we've got movement in this direction, the Canadian Council on Animal Care and UBC agree to take the results of deliberation seriously, including these, that we recruit some samples to be able to start doing some deliberations, that we have wide publicity for the issues. The materials we produce for deliberation need to be trusted in the sense that no matter what your perspective, you got to look at them and say, that was well informed. And once you've got those materials that are that complete, they should be widely available. And the deliberation itself is a source of encouraging people to have further discussion. And then we design new governance. We assess it. We have public input. We identify threshold points at which we have to return because there's disagreement, and we revise and assess again. And governance has got to be adaptive and move along, so this is an iterative process. Thank you.
So now I'd like to open it up to the floor for comments, discussion. Try and keep your points reasonably focused on the topics, and if there's a particular person you would like to address a remark to, please indicate that too. Please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Brian Vincent with WBC Animal Research. I had two questions. Why is the system in Canada so rigged against the public? And shouldn't the public have more of an opportunity to participate? And I think there are two recent cases in UBC that highlight how broken and corrupt the system is. And the first one is, you may have read in the news today that UBC researchers published a study about injecting speed and caffeine into rats to determine how people perform at the workplace. And I would argue that the public had no participation in deciding how their tax dollars are spent to jack up rats with crank and espresso, which seems like a complete waste of taxpayer money. The other is this case of the 4 monkeys killed here at UBC. My organization filed a complaint with the Canadian Council on Animal Care about the 4 monkeys. And the system is so corrupt because the composition of the CCAC is of the 22 members, 21 support animal research. Only 1 is an animal lover. 2, what the CCAC allows. You can burn an animal alive legally in Canada. So, of course, they're not going to rule what UBC did was cruel to these monkeys. And then finally, they don't disclose any information to us. They just rule that that UBC is cleared of any animal cruelty, but they won't hand over the necropsy reports, the veterinary reports, their assessments, the protocols. We have to take the word of essentially the fox guarding the hen house.
So, comment from any of the panels that wasn't addressed to any particular person. Anyone would like to comment? Sure. Max? Yeah.
When Franz de Waal was here, he described research using mice in which researchers had found that when mice were experienced pain in the presence of other mice, and then the other mice were subsequently subjected to painful procedures, they seemed to suffer more. And it wasn't only that they suffered more because they had seen what was going to happen to them, so they were alerted to the in perhaps evolutionary terms, the presence of a predator. But they were particularly distressed by mice of their own group, so partners, for example, that were subjected to pain beforehand. So what that suggested to devolve was that there is a capacity for empathy among mice. It's an extraordinary thing to think about. And so part of what I'm trying to argue is if that's the case, what does that mean to how we do this kind of research? And I had the opportunity to speak with a researcher who does work with mice. And I said, when you do experiments involving mice, do you talk with other researchers, with your students, for example, about what's going on? About is this a moral event? Is this an event that we should be alert to as having implications for us? I mean, after all, we know that kids who torture animals are far more likely to wind up before the courts in prison, charges of various kinds of delinquency. So hurting animals is, generally speaking, not a good thing for humans to be doing. If you're hurting animals that have a capacity for empathy, what's the moral significance of that? And is that even a conversation? And it's not. I don't think it's even discussed. And there's certainly no procedures or guidelines for doing that. So I think these are enormously significant questions. On the question of publicity and disclosure, my sense is that the obstacles don't come so much from the researchers, though there's room for them to be educated, but rather on the part of the university, and a lot of it's driven, of course, by proprietary issues. But I totally agree with you. I think that there should be a good deal more transparency, because if you can't, I mean, this goes to the point of, I take deliberative democracy to be a system in which those who are in power have to provide reasons for their actions and defend them against criticism. If you can't defend what you're doing publicly against criticism, then you've got no business doing it. There's a prima facie case that what you're doing is unjust. So that's the standard that I think that we should strive for.
Any other comments on this? Manisha?
Yes, thank you for that comment. I also wanted to add, like, I really think the kind of non-subject status of animals in, outside of the legal sphere and within the legal sphere explains why there's this frustration about non-involvement and the non-engagement of certain levels of interest. So the whole system is set up in a very anthropocentric way, right? So certain interests count and others don't. And the law reflects our kind of indirect attention to animals coming out of a Kantian tradition, right? So where the law does advert to animals, like formally in some type of statute, it is done indirectly. For example, the criminal code, general provisions about anti-cruelty, or let's say endangered species types of legislation, like the Species at Risk Act. But that type of advertence is, from my analysis, and other scholars have also said this, I'm not the person to make this point in a novel way, is that it is just an animal's interest can only be looked at when it's attached to a human interest, and that's the subject, or corporate interest, the legal person. That's the subject that the law can see. So one of the reasons I remarked upon this Alberta Court of Appeal case about the elephant, Lucy, was that the idea of public interest standing is only relevant when you don't have standing yourself, right? When you don't have standing directly. And animals do not have standing directly because they're not legal subjects. And thus it makes it difficult then for those who are subjects in the eyes of the law, all of us here, who might want to advocate, to find the legal route to bring, to have a claim where they don't rely on the benevolence of an agency or an organization to give them information, but to come and demand it through the law. And because it's so set up for our legal system not to attend to these interests, that's where all these roadblocks ensue.
Another comment or question? Yes, we'll go over there.
The concept of the practical wisdom was raised, and the other concept that's been raised is, the question I think that's been raised is the composition of the committees. And so I wonder if any of you have comments on how those committees are constituted or might be constituted in a way that, maybe reflecting on the fact that the committees could be constituted in a way that you either had representatives who felt like they were responsible to stakeholders compared to a method that would constitute these committees by ensuring that the people who were selected for the committees were the right people who had the kind of practical wisdom that would be necessary to deliberate on these kinds of important decisions.
I don't think it would be feasible to select a committee even mainly or simply on the kind of deliberative and moral wisdom that a member of the committee had, because I think the criteria for doing that would be very tricky, although one could select people on the basis of the kinds of experiences they've had, not just doing research, but in terms of talking and deliberating about those issues. But the question you raised, though, is a very interesting one, because most of the criticisms of the animal care committees don't focus on so much on how people deliberate and on the difficulties of deliberation. They do focus on the question of representation. The CCAC guidelines, I think, just demand that there be a minimum of one representative from the community on the committees. So one, for example, could fight for a change in those guidelines, so there would be 2 representatives from the, or 3. But then one has to ask, well, what does it mean to be a representative of the community? Do we mean a representative of what most people in British Columbia think, what most people at UBC think, what animal rights advocates think? Are we using the word representation and community as a surrogate because we want to say I'm a stakeholder and my position isn't represented on the community? It's a kind of fudge term. So then the question becomes, well, who counts as, should all stakeholders be represented? And one could say, well, yeah, maybe all stakeholders should be represented. But Mike has a really good point that stakeholders don't represent everybody that needs to be represented. So it's a tricky issue. It's interesting the way the BC Assembly tried this, and I think it's worth discussing on animal care committees or as part of this, is that they solved the problem by instead of choosing people by what their interests were or what their stakeholding was, they chose them by lot. They chose them randomly. I don't think you could choose an entire ACC like that, because you need people who actually understand something about animal research. Maybe some people could be chosen in that way. But I think I don't have a simple answer to that. I think it's a truly difficult issue. I was fascinated, and Mike, I think we might want to turn to on this, by this process that you were describing in Western Australia, where you had 2 committees, one that involved the stakeholders and one that didn't involve the stakeholders. That wasn't for making decisions about implementation, that was for making decisions about guidelines, which is what Max was talking about. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about how that might work as a way, not to run the ACCs, but to actually have a way to decide how the ACCs would be run. What do you think?
So part of what we're after here is something that is practical in the sense that we can get decisions made in an expedited way that still manifests the kind of sensitivity and care that is appropriate. And one of the biggest challenges there is institutional investment. There isn't a lot of investment in creating that. So if we, for example, said, let's put everyone through a deliberative experience where they're well skilled in deliberative engagement, that's got resource implications that you might, first of all, select against many people who have a sort of native sense that they want to participate in this because they don't have the time to do it. And so part of the challenge is just how exactly do we invest in creating this? I think the idea too that we've got, and this is in part as a response to the previous question too, is that while we're trying to come up with efficient mechanisms, we also have to have mechanisms that are accountable, that are reasonable, and that do have a kind of range of representation. And we routinely see committee members, community representatives on committees, that they can't represent anyone except for themselves because they only bring their own experience. And what's happened in deliberations is people get a sense of the range of perspectives. And those of us in ethics who are often on committees find ourselves, I found myself in a moratorium on reproductive technologies, taking the perspective of a woman who uses reproductive technologies because she happened to be absent that day. And next thing I know, I was arguing for a reproductive endocrinologist because he happened to be absent that day. And it's that, what we're trying to do is get people to care about hearing each other's perspectives to make sure the situation is well considered. And the only way I've seen that happen in BC is the BC Dentist Association, the council, has 50% public members and 50% dentists.
And how are the public members chosen? Do you know?
I don't know the answer to that. They're very diverse.
Right. That would be interesting as a way to open up the answer to your question, I think.
Over here?
And how do they get people to serve? I mean, this is a big commitment. Our research on animal care committees in the past is that it is not easy to get community members who are willing to do this.
There's a chicken and egg thing here too, because what we found was we paid people $100 a day for 4 days to come into these deliberations. And they came, and we always sit there in tenterhooks waiting for enough people to show up to come to deliberation. The second weekend, we never lose more than 2 people out of 25. And I don't think it's $100 because they know how exhausting this is. It's a pittance compared to what they're doing. But they get dedicated and have a sense of solidarity and they start showing. So in part it's not how do you keep them, it's how do you get them in the door if you can get them interested. And I think that's, again, where we have to go to a wider public deliberation.
Okay, over here, yes.
Yes, I'm concerned with the complete absence of any invertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and most birds. It seems to me that the criteria that were mentioned for inclusion in the, what you call a moral community, were very anthropocentric. And I work with fishes myself, and one of the problems that I perceive is a lack of knowledge about the behavior and social systems of a great many so-called lower vertebrates and invertebrates. And I'd like to see that rectified. And the other thing I wanted to say was how very much I enjoyed every single talk. They're very exciting.
Could I ask you just a question to elaborate on? I think Max would probably be the best person to, one of the people to answer this since he raised it. But suppose we could do more scientific research on invertebrates and we could know more about them. What would some of the things be that you would suggest that we would want to know more about? On fish, for example, which is your field.
And how much time do you
Well, just maybe an example. I just am trying to get my mind
sensory
around it.
perception. I mean, even the term ultrasound is anthropocentric because the upper limit of hearing is the upper limit of human hearing. But it was relatively recently discovered that so many different animals can hear ultrasound, not just bats, not which are mammals, but some fishes. Some fishes have hearing ranges that are greater than humans. The sensory world, there are a number of animals that can see in the ultraviolet. This will have implications for the way we keep them. Animals that are social at only certain times of the year. And to be asocial is not, I'm using too many negatives. Even if you're asocial, you are worthy of moral consideration, is my feeling. But the way I feel about it, and it's subjective, yes, it's particular, it's individual, contextual, and I don't categorize the way you seem to be doing. So I wanted to just express my objection.
Max?
I very much appreciate the comment. I should say I actually brought with me my copy of Peter Singer, Practical Ethics. I became interested in these issues in large measure as a consequence of hearing him speak at UBC many, many years ago. And so my position is very much informed by the kind of perspective that he's taken, and it's vulnerable, I think, to this criticism. So partly I think I'll acknowledge that what you're saying is probably very, very true. But let me highlight a couple of what I think are valuable features of this perspective nonetheless. So the first thing I would say is it follows from the kind of argument that I was making, or that Singer has made, that the kind of consideration that we think animals are merit or deserve is going to depend very heavily on our knowledge. And so it's easier to understand, it's easier to do research with chimpanzees and bonobos and elephants and to determine, do they have a concept of self and other? Do they help one another? Are they social creatures? Do they have, within their groups, dynamics within one group that's different from those within another. So it's a lot easier doing research on those kinds of animals than it is even on dolphins or whales, let alone on fish or other or invertebrates or a marine life. So we have a knowledge barrier, which would, for me, then that says that the kind of research that you do is incredibly important, and I want to know more about it. And if I could persuade myself, or if I could be persuaded, and I'm sure that there is a lot of evidence of complex social behavior among fish, among some species of fish at least, that would certainly affect my view of the kind of concern that one would want to, hence the kind of legal protection that one would want to give to those animals. You make the argument about anthropocentrism, and I think that that's a fair argument. My position has on that tended to be that it's not such a bad thing to be anthropomorphic in our relationships with animals. If it's by anthropomorphizing animals that we cultivate our capacity for empathy and understanding of them, if it's precisely that we see qualities that strike us as incredibly human in animals, and then reflect back on what it means to be human, that we learn more about animals, then that's a route to knowledge. It's not necessarily such a bad thing. And I think that as a practical matter, it simply is a lot easier to find. I mean, we know that there's no question that when we look at a seal, we look at a baby seal, there's a response that we have to that. These are charismatic animals, and I think that those become the champions for extending animal rights because it's easy to make the case. And if you can make the case for a chimpanzee or for a seal, we'll get there with dolphins, and if we can get there with dolphins, maybe we'll get there with fish as well. But I completely accept the observation that you're making. It's a valid complaint about the position I'm taking. I just can't really I just can't make the argument any other way that works for me.
Okay. So let's go over here, and then you go ahead.
I have two questions, one for Max and one for Minisha. My first question is, now I was a bit, and thanks for the previous comment, because I was also a bit distressed by your comment that the bar should be low for animals that have a diminished inner moral universe, and so it seems to me more important, or perhaps related to the concern of morality and empathy, is how does consent come into this, and how does consent exactly relate to empathy and doesn't? Because it seems to me what's most important in these relationships is that the agents that are most impacted are consenting agents. And then, so my question from Nisha then is that you said that if we were to give animals personhood, this would lead to an end of research, because these animals are non-consenting moral subjects. Now, do you say that because you assume that animals cannot give consent, and because they cannot give consent, the research would end? Or do you assume that all the animals that are currently being experimented on, or potentially would be experimented on, would consent or would not give consent? So it's a question of the inability to give consent, or would they say no?
Should I go first? Okay. So I think as humans, we are fundamentally limited in how we can understand what animals want. So I think we have to acknowledge that kind of gap in our ability to know and let go of the consuming desire always to know the other. We have to accept that there's some limits. So if there is a viable, practical way for us to kind of remedy our deficiencies in understanding other animals so that we could really legitimately have a good way to understand consent, then I would be in favor of trying to ascertain consent. But given kind of what goes on in research laboratories not being like happy, rosy experiences, but rather being things that most beings would want to get away from, the disease models and so on and so forth, then I would presume a non-consent stance where we can ascertain consent, and for that reason we have to say it's problematic.
It seems to me that you can make inferences about consent from behavior, and so behavioral research on animals is incredibly important for understanding what they want and don't want, and some of this stuff is pretty obvious, right? So, but on the issue of sort of the rights of animals, my position, and so a rights position to me, kind of a Kantian position is if you can establish any kind of intersubjectivity with an animal, if you can communicate, in effect, with the animal, then there's something wrong about using it as a means to your own ends. And that's kind of a simple Kantian sort of argument. So for me, there is a bias in favor of, to be blunt, animals with faces, animals that you can look at and communicate with. It's a lot easier for me to imagine the possibility of including within some notion of rights those creatures with whom humans can establish, and that's an anthropomorphic position, intersubjective communication. But of course, it should also depend on the kind of sociability that exists among the animals. And so knowledge about that, again, to repeat, I think is critically important, but it's elusive, or can be.
So I guess I should go over here. Have you asked a question yet? No. No. Okay, you have it. Okay.
So this may be a question more so for Manisha. Manisha, you talked about feminist relational theory, and I've been trying to think about animal rights in terms of anti-oppressionist feminist theory, and I see them as obviously related, but I thought it was interesting that, and my understanding is that the feminist relational theory is maybe more focused on interconnectedness, whereas I would see anti-oppressionist feminism more concerned with power structures and how people are situated in them. And I understand that they both probably have elements, but I thought it was interesting that it's the interconnectedness that was your focus. And if I'm correct about that, then I'm just curious about knowing more about why you think that is the best approach of all the feminisms in terms of animal rights.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, Amber. Thank you. So my own perspective is to kind of think of these issues through a feminist post-colonial perspective that also incorporates queer theory. So this idea of difference and the other. The reason I kind of highlighted feminist relational theory today is because I see it present in an actual legal judgment, whereas kind of the more critical deconstructionist theories aren't yet there in actual legal judgments. But I do want to say that I think relational theory, when we hear the word relational, we immediately think of just kind of personal interconnections, and actual relational theory in this feminist version goes beyond that. So the second tenet I had on my slide about relationships, meaning relationships of power, not just personal relationships, such that if you look at Chief Justice Fraser's judgment, right, we had an opportunity to see her opening paragraph where she says, quite differently than how the majority starts off his judgment, Lucy's elephants are social animals. So in addition to that, she starts talking about being in a position of vulnerability and dependence, and that is a kind of the power element in terms of the whole social sphere, not just like an interrelation that the problem is that she just doesn't have a partner, right, to be around her, that she brings into the mix. So I wanted to highlight relational theory today. I do think it's a valid theory. It's, but I also think other theories are valuable. But to go back to your first question, that it is concerned with power relationships and not just a more personalized, individual connectedness.
Can I ask Manisha a question on this, or do you not want us to talk to each other?
Why not? Go ahead, ask the question.
So just to have to put some things that Max says in contrast to some things that you're saying, because I think it's really interesting, particularly in response to the question Max just answered. Max is focusing on sameness. In many part, it's the ways in which the animals are more like human beings, no?
Not sameness and difference. It's both things. Both are equally significant, and it's getting right. The ways in which they're similar and the ways in which they're different.
But is it fair to
Not
say
both.
that the ways in which they're similar are the ways in which they move up higher on your scale?
Okay.
And for you want to get rid of the whole sameness kind of argument, and actually difference becomes not a negative for you.
Right,
It
yes.
actually becomes a positive. So you take the idea of difference and actually want to ground animal treatment on some element of difference, as opposed.
Or not to stigmatize difference. So
Not to
I think the
stigmatize
way,
difference, okay.
yes. So if you
Keep
kind of,
going.
all right.
Because I don't quite get it, but I think
Okay.
it's really interesting.
So if you look at the way a lot of, let's say, equality campaigns have moved forward, right, in our kind of limited history of the last 50, 60 years, and you will see that, right, if we look at equality campaigns moving forward, how things are articulated, think of same-sex marriage, right? So what is the dominant way that became popularized, mainstreamed, is this argument that we're like you, right? And we have to show the mainstream why we are saying to the benchmark that matters, right? And so there's so much like internal debate in the queer communities about whether or not that was successful and was that too much of a sacrifice and all of that. But that's kind of what works at the mainstream level. That's how you have to couch the argument. Like here's the standard we all accept, and now we have to convince the mainstream why we are similar such that we should come under the coveted umbrella of who matters. Okay, so I don't want to discount those types of campaigns. There can be good reasons and urgent reasons for doing things that way, right? It's a kind of a separate debate to have. But I would like us to move toward a way of speaking, especially about animals, because of the sense that maybe there is some type of incommensurable differences among all of us, no matter like what gender, class, race, ethnicity, sexual status, orientation status, that there might be something categorically different between different animals, between themselves, and between humans and different animals, such that, you know, here's a moment to really think about difference. And I think we should think about difference in the human-human context and not just presume sameness and think that we're all the same. But is there a way to articulate arguments for inclusiveness and justice that don't rely on a sameness logic? 'Cause to me, and many others, it seems that what we're just doing is, you know, just moving the lines around, right? So right now, a lot of animal advocates, post-human advocates, are contesting the human-animal boundary, right? Here's our line. This is where you count, and this is where you don't. This is where you're a legal subject, and this is where you're not. And if we go to like very popular arguments like the Great Ape Project or what have you about the kind of humanized animals in our community, so some of you may have are familiar with the work of Carrie Wolf, a humanities scholar in this field who talks about a species grid. Others have also made a similar point, right? That each society has its version of the humanized animals and has its version of animalized animals, and also has an idea of humanized humans and animalized humans, right? So you kind of have four spaces here. The humanized humans, we all know who those are. The animalized humans, we can all imagine who those are as well. Then the humanized animals, right? And the animalized animals. And so this, especially the latter two categories, shift around in different cultures, different nations, different regions. Okay, so we can see the humanized animal. Who gets to be a humanized animal? Are those animals that we think are like ourselves, or that we relate to because they have a face, or they do things that we think are like smiley, or they look nice, they look cute, right? Whatever resonates in that culture in terms of how we relate. Whereas animals are the ones that we don't respond to, right? Or that we don't know a lot about, or whatever there's a cultural stigma about. So I would like us to think about, how can we make an argument about justice for animals, about democracy for animals, about what even deliberative conversations should be about animals, that thinks about how to really engage with difference and value difference rather than proceed, even though it might be strategic and there's legitimate reasons for doing it, through a sameness logic.
Yeah, over there.
Just a comment. The point just made and the point about invertebrates, lower vertebrates, link together really well. Because in particular, squid, and which have a lot of cognitive function, are animalized animals, right? Yes, there are other reasons for thinking that they actually deserve it or earn they should be objects of a lot of concern. So it's like the fish pond in a way.
Yeah, no, it is a fish pond, yes.
Okay. Yeah?
So I'm looking at my watch, thinking that we don't have much time to come up with a call for action. And I need some help from you in sort of wondering what our next steps are. And so maybe this is mostly directed to Mike, but I'd be interested in what anyone else says too. So right now we've got a process where we have hundreds of protocols a year. And it seems to me we need to be thinking about how we evaluate the very structure around which we make decisions, which sounds like maybe what you're talking about, Mike, with coming up with a deliberative democracy structure that goes through and asks, should we be using animals in it at all, and if so, under what constraints? That might create our structure. But we also need to be thinking about the at the more fine-grained, immediately level of, and maybe this comes back to some of what the other speakers are talking about in terms of creating decision-making bodies that make good decisions. And I guess I was intrigued, Mike, to see whether, I think you hinted at that case of actually a deliberative democracy engagement that ended up becoming a decision-making body. But I don't know if that's something that you're actually, are you suggesting that as a model for now, or what, how would you like us to proceed?
So not to use the word sameness in the wrong context, the similarity I'm seeing is a lack of trustworthy governance. That the governance that exists isn't trusted, and to get trust, we need to be able to figure out how the controversies are being negotiated on an ongoing basis, be able to review that. So the suspicion, the lack of transparency are all components that undermine the trust. And to be able to figure out what would be trustworthy governance in this area is something that each of us would have a different view in this room of. But the challenge is, how do we come together with a shared view about how we can trust the system that we put in place, and that system itself is adaptive or dynamic enough that it identifies the real controversial choices and has greater degrees of accountability there, whereas when it's making decisions that are more routine, we trust it to make those decisions. But the thresholds are part of the thing that we have to build into the governance. Where are the thresholds when we need to re-engage more widely than depending on the committee?
So what I was arguing, to put what I was saying in Mike's charts, which are nice, I think, I was saying, given a governance structure like the ACC, how can you make it more deliberative in terms of, and the people on it that are capable of deliberating in terms of whatever guidelines that you have? And that would be, in some sense, the implementation. Mike took a half-hour presentation and spoke very quickly, so I didn't get it all, but I liked what I can remember. So implementation, deliberation was important for implementation. But there's this prior question which you're onto and which Mike is speaking about now, which is deliberate, which was the first thing on that slide, which was governance itself. How you could set up a deliberative process that would create a governance structure that would be better. So what you would first deliberate about would be how the ACC should be organized, or whatever ethics committee should be organized, and that would include things like Brian's questions about the amount of transparency and how you balance, this is a great practical wisdom question, how you balance transparency with proprietary secrecy that you have to keep with the safety of the people who are doing the research, because both of those are goods. It's got to be transparent, but it's got to be balanced. So how to set up a process to come up with something that could be governing process that would trust seems to be, in some sense, a prior question, though it would demand a certain kind of practical wisdom and deliberative body to do, would be prior to the kinds of things that I was talking about. That's what I see. I don't know if that's helpful.
Over here, yes.
Yeah, so my question is going to be kind of out there, but I'm wondering how important do you think it is for the animals themselves to be present at these committee meetings? So, I mean, the reason why I ask that is, well, in one sense, you don't want them to be purely objects that people just talk about them. You do want them. You do, I mean, we understand that animals are subjects and that they do generate emotions in us when we see them. So in that sense, they are, you know, autonomous agents and they do hold some sort of power. But I think at a more sort of practical concern is there are people who think, you know, by looking at animals, that is a form of manipulation. So it's this whole like reason versus emotion thing about how we deliberate. So I was wondering, you know, how do we balance that? Do you think animals should be present at these meetings?
Not represented, but literally present.
Yeah, or like through an image, I guess, maybe photos or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really is in a way, the question. I think that's a really important question. And when we talk about the composition of the committees and who's represented, are we interested in reaching decisions that we, as a group of humans involved in the practice of research, can live with? Or are we interested in reaching decisions that reflect not only our interests, but also the interests of the animals that are affected? Is there a place for, or is there a way of incorporating
that concerns the interests, the rights of animals into these procedures, and that's extremely difficult, right? Because obviously, there has to be either some form of representation, or there has to be some way of bringing the knowledge that would be necessary for those perspectives to be incorporated into our discussions. And I think this goes back to, in a way, to Brian's point at the outset. It seems to me there's a fundamental conflict of interest, and it's connected to the court case in Edmonton. There's a fundamental conflict of interest when the mechanisms, the deliberative procedures that we use to arrive at these decisions that affect the animals are controlled by the very institutions that are engaged in the process. The analogy that comes to my mind is military courts that try foreign combatants, right? And the argument against trying using a military court to bring to trial somebody who's been captured in the context of a conflict is that the military is fighting a war. Its interest is in winning the war, and therefore it has an interest in extracting as much information as possible from the enemies that it's captured, and in imposing the greatest possible punishment, if indeed annihilating that person. So the military has no business putting foreign combatants on trial. That's a fundamental principle of the separation of powers, right? That is being violated. I think there's a sense in which you have to ask yourself the question: if the body that puts in place the mechanisms that are used to determine what's ethical and not ethical treatment of animals, is that if that body is created by the very institution that is conducting this research, there isn't a sufficient separation of interests on the part of the research community from the interests of the animals. And part of, Mark Warren is here, and Mark's done a lot of work on things like the BC Citizens Assembly. And I think one of the arguments for, one of the ways in which Mark talks about the Citizens Assembly, which I really like, is this is a kind of an institution that is supplemental to democracy. So when we look at when we look at reform to the electoral system, what we're doing when we create a citizens' assembly is we're taking the decision out of the hands of the partisans. We're saying the people who are going to be directly affected by that decision, that is the politicians running for office under party labels, don't get to decide what kind of system we'll have. We're going to put that in the hands of people who have no stake in the matter from a partisan perspective. Their only stake in the matter is as citizens. So what we need, it would seem to me, is a no-brainer that at the very minimum, the bodies that are responsible for making these ethical decisions can't be bodies that are run by and controlled by the university. There has to be a degree of independence. If there isn't some separation of powers there, that's only the beginning, right? That doesn't get you to how you then constitute that body and how you cultivate the kind of practices within it that would be necessary to get you to wise decisions. But at a very minimum, we need to understand that the university has a set of interests that are in conflict with the interests of animals, and therefore it cannot be a body that is controlled by the university who makes those decisions.
Yes, please.
I wanted to challenge how you framed, and I'm sorry I didn't catch your name.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, Ken Sharp.
I wanted to challenge how you framed the moral deliberation as one of needing balance. And in the way that you spoke, it was as if we're already speaking about a balanced issue. It's not a balanced issue. We have humans who have needs, and we have other animals who we bring into the equation fighting. They're non-consenting animals, so it's already one of unbalance. And so I think that framework is faulty and, dare I say, unfair.
I think, let me articulate a position which would argue that you were right, and then let me raise a question or two about it. I think if you take a position that there should be no research ever done on animals because there's something about the character of who animals are, the kind of moral consideration one wants to give to animals, that there should never be any research done on animals in which there's any kind of inconvenience, harm, or suffering, then I think you would eliminate 90 or 95% of the balance problems with a rule. It's just that it's over. It's as you said in an earlier panel, why don't we just stop it? Was your, I think your very simple and articulate way of putting it. So on that kind of notion or paradigm, then there's an end to it. You don't need an ACC, really. You just don't do it anymore. There are serious questions about whether that position is the correct position, and there's certainly very serious questions about whether that position would be accepted in a democracy like the Canadian democracy. And I don't think it would matter to you and others if it weren't accepted. That would still be your position, and you'd have good grounds for it. We could set up a deliberative governance process like Mike was talking about, and in which we could inform a body of citizens that were relatively neutral about all the different issues in which you and Brian and others could make as strong and articulate arguments as you could, at which others would make different arguments. We could have, as a result of that, a decision that there are conditions under which animals could be harmed in order to do research of a certain kind, and that were popularly accepted even by a vote in the province after a neutral citizens committee dealt on it. It would not be, as Mike also said, there would be people who would reasonably disagree with that. But if the position that you're articulating isn't the one that's accepted, if there's anything less than that, then there are always going to be problems of balance, because you're going to be figuring out the harm of one animal versus another animal, of an individual animal versus a species of animal, if it's animal research, of weighing human health against animal health, of figuring out what kind of animal in what way, of how many animals. There will be, as you say, I think you're exactly right, and you're also being very articulate on this, there is a difference in the balance of power there. And there is, in some sense, there's no way that the animals will rise up to exercise their power. It's going to be other human beings that will rise up and exercise their power in the name of those animals. But anything less than an absolute ban, I think, is going to demand the kind of balance problems that I'm suggesting.
Very quickly, just quickly make a comment.
We're really down to the last 5 minutes. Maybe you could take this up just afterwards, and we're down to the last 5 minutes for questions. So there are probably others who would like to get in here, and I'm conscious of that. If you haven't had the opportunity, if you'd like a comment or something like that, I think it's well worth taking up. But over here, yes, please.
I'm a PhD student in cultural anthropology, and for my research, I looked at communities in Kentucky who are rescuing thoroughbred racehorses from slaughter. And of those communities was a prison vocational program. And my ethics review for the prisoners, I had to do two separate reviews, one for just a reschooling program and then one for the prison program. And my ethics review for the prisoners was long and drawn out, and questions of consent and so forth, very illuminating. But my research involves animals. I rode horses, I cared for horses, I volunteered at a barn where they take in these rescue horses and kind of refashion them. So I asked my advisor, I said, should I go through an animal review board? And he said, no, you don't want to go there. Because A, I'm a social scientist, and B, I'm not doing research on animals, I'm doing research with animals. And like Manisha, I'm very interested in kind of critical animal studies, Carrie Wolf and of course, Peter Singer and so forth, and really kind of practicing holding myself up to my own moral standards informed by all these incredible critical scholars. But at the same time, there seems to be an institutional lag, which is a double-edged sword, because we hold ourselves accountable, should we be held accountable by the ACC when we're doing social science with animals. There is a whole burgeoning movement in the humanities social science called multi-species ethnography, where we really are trying to see animals as having agency, having consent, looking at how they're treated by our community of study, humans and the humans who enact on them,
But what are the ethical, what would be the protocol for us? It's an emerging field. Do we want to invite institutional, all these deliberations? Or do we, by virtue of the disciplinary, humanistic disciplinary divides, stay out of that debate entirely, even though we're so concerned with these questions of personhood, moral and ethical relationships between humans and other animals? So.
Right. Just quickly, be careful not to expect committee review to take care of all our moral responsibilities. Right?
Yeah.
We build relationships, and therein lies the real morality and ethics. The committees are oversight, where we may be in a conflict of interest, to help us see through and make balanced judgments. That's their only role, and if we reduce all morality to committee review, we are impoverished, deeply impoverished. So you may well be in a great moral relationship, where framing it then for committee review could do violence to the very moral relationship you strike with the animals, because the committee is not accustomed to reviewing the sorts of thing and then has to contort itself to deal with those issues. So be careful not to confuse committee review with moral status.
Well, I think we're probably at that very stage where I will ask Laura to come back. We're going to ask, were there any quick observations from members of the panel here? You had one more sort of a little bit of overtime to just briefly, if you have something that you would like to say at the end here before Laura comes up and closes the series out. So, would you like, Manisha, why don't you start?
Just a few comments. The first one is the question of balance. So I think it's important to know that's an excellent question to raise, but that we deal with balance all the time at the human level, right? So when you have a constitutional claim about a certain law, typically it's one human right engaging with another human right, and what is a court tasked to do is to balance. So we have balance and we deal with balance all the time. What I think some of the comments here were directed at is to include more of the interest into the balance that we're trying to get at. And I really appreciate the question as well about should animals be here? And in many ways this is a conversation, although it's hard to know how to proceed otherwise, where you have just the majority group talking about a minority group without even weighing their interests that importantly.
It's
right?
actually the minority group
Yes.
talking about the majority group.
Exactly, right? And so if you look at the numbers. And so it just seems like, where would we do this ever? Like, how could this be legitimate as any way to proceed in terms of really valuing interest? So I think that's an important point. And the final point is the emotion reason point. And I think that we have a legal culture and a larger culture, Western culture, that devalues emotion. And our engagements, especially through the CCAC, which is, built up in a natural sciences field, is against kind of reasoning through emotion, or even acknowledging that the mind and body are connected and we should think. Thinking involves caring, emotions, feeling. And if we oriented our way that way, we might go to a different place.
No, pass.
So I just wanted to say briefly, because I think where I've got the most sort of pushback from listening to you is on the question of being too anthropomorphic and of not valuing those forms of life enough that don't have complex inner lives, or for which you could easily see, or for which it's easy for us to see something like the existence of moral consideration within the animals themselves. And so I just wanted to clarify one point, which is that you could approach these issues from many different perspectives. One would be animal welfare, which is different from animal rights. Another would be a kind of an ecological perspective. And I think that those are all valid and important. And in fact, I tried to integrate each of those perspectives in different ways in my own comments. But really, when we are talking about rights, that's where I think it becomes difficult not to make the arguments to some extent anthropomorphic, and to not value those qualities that enable us to reach some kind of agreement, or where consensus really matters. Because moral rights, if they mean anything, they have to do with moral agency. And so in that sense, if we're going to use the language of rights, I think we're going to be stuck with that. We have to live with that as a fact of matter. But I do want to say that as a clarification, because I think that's an appealing perspective. I think it's an intellectually defensible perspective, and I think it's the basis for a political program that's important. But it's not the only perspective that one could take.
Did you have any? No? Well, I'd like to thank all the panelists, so if we could appreciate it. And now for the concluding message from the convener. And Laura, it's yours.
Thank you so much. I am so happy and excited. Michael, thank you for moderating tonight. And you asked me for some final words of wisdom. My final words of wisdom are words of thanks. I think it's very wise to say thank you, and that is what I want to say now. I want to thank tonight's panelists. You've made an enormous contribution to our community tonight. Thank you so very much. And you've helped to illuminate, I think, where we need to go now in our community. All of our panelists through the whole series have contributed enormously to this discussion. They've been game to come and share their standpoints with us, and so I thank all of them. I think this series shows that we are a community of scholars that is ready to inform shifts in institutional practice. I think that's who we are. I also want to thank Mark Vesey, the principal of Green College, who welcomed our very challenging topic. He embraced us right from the start. And he's exerted himself in a variety of extremely thoughtful ways to facilitate this discussion. He's not here tonight, but I just want to say we think you are great, Mark. And thank you to the staff at Green College who've been so warmly hospitable to us, especially to Alan Gumbach and to Tatiana Tomjanovich. I think I said it right? Exactly right. Okay. I want to say a special thanks to Max Cameron as well. Max has been a wonderful panelist, as you've all witnessed tonight. He's been a collaborator all year on this series, and he's also been a personal sounding board for me, and that's just been so helpful to me in ways I'm sure that you don't even know, Max, so thank you so much. When my students and I first hatched this plan for this series, we went looking for collaborators on the other end of campus because we're way up here on the north end of campus where we do social science and humanities work. And we were just thrilled to find the folks in the animal welfare program. We were thrilled to find David Fraser and Dan Weary and Nina von Kaiserlink, who's not here tonight, and also Elizabeth Ormandy, who've been our very good colleagues all year, great collaborators in this series, and we're just so happy to be connected to you, and we look forward to future connection. A number of the panelists have said thank you, Laura, and I would just like to say that Laura really operates as a rubric that houses incredible students. And I just want to say to my students, you've done something very meaningful. You've done something very good, and it is my great joy to work with you. Finally, I will collect myself. In the spirit of this series, let us remain attuned to the lived lives and the deaths of the animals that are at UBC. They are part of the collective that we have been aiming to bring together. There is one non-human animal in the room tonight. That is wonderful. Everyone have a look at this great dog who's here. And let us remember all of the thousands and thousands of animals and of very different kinds of animals who are here at UBC in our community. Thank you, everyone.